All right, it's 12:45. Jason, are you ready for us to get started?
We are ready and excited.
Great. Well, welcome back, everybody. We hope that you found this morning's sessions to be interesting and helpful as you start your new grants with us. And I wanted to remind everybody to make sure you're muted and so forth as we go forth. I'm really, really excited to introduce our afternoon speaker, Jean Allen. I've seen her speak on numerous topics, and all of them were fabulous. So I learned something every single time. I learned something every single time. She's got 25 years in the nonprofit world and higher education. So I've seen her at the Duke Nonprofit Management Center. In my old role with Volunteer NC, she did a lot of presentations for us to help build the capacity of nonprofits, including diversity, equity, inclusion. So I think that you will all get I would recommend taking notes because she does say some really good nuggets and things that you will want to implement yourself. So without further ado, Ms. Allen, if you'll take over.
Great. Thank you so much for your comments. It's hard to live up to something like that, but I hope to. I do like to give people lots of nuggets. And we're going to go through a series of information ideas around working with a nonprofit board today. We'll have the slides available for you afterwards. So what I want you to do is just listen, write down questions you have. And the best thing to do would be questions that you can then take back to your board or to your coworkers and start having conversations. The number one thing I'll tell you about working with boards is if you've worked with one board, you've worked with one board. They're all a bit different. So if you're a startup nonprofit versus a nationally, connected nonprofit versus regional versus statewide, you're all very different. So what I'm going to give you is what I call the bones of nonprofits and, kind of the structure and everything you have to build around it. I'm making sure everything's working here. Great. So this is just my little intro that kind of builds on what Caroline just talked about. I'm a consultant. I do classes through the Duke Nonprofit Program, which are people like you, adults who are in the nonprofit world working on a certificate. It's not undergraduate classes. The other thing about me is I am BoardSource certified. BoardSource is a national organization that kind of is a think tank around boards. A lot of their material, well, not a lot, there is a lot of material that's free. Then they sell books and they have other things, but you could go on their website. But I use a lot of their material today. We're looking at the responsibilities of boards. So there's just BoardSource, and you can look at that. What I did need to slip in here is the fact that even though I teach for the Duke Nonprofit Program, I'm a Carolina fan and a Carolina graduate. So, in Durham, we have both color blues, and I know some of you have gold or maroon or many other colors, red, that you fall for, but I just wanted to let you know I am the Carolina fan, but that may not make anybody any happier. All right, now here is a picture. Just want to get you thinking here. Here's a picture, and here's what I want you to see. On a scale of dog, how you feeling today? So you pick a number and just put it in the chat box. Just want to see where you are on a scale of gold and purple. I see the other colors. Okay, I can try to say every color. So on a scale of dog, how you doing? I like to see where people are. 3 means you're kind of hanging out and ready, maybe. A lot of you are at 2. That's pretty good. That means you're thinking, ready to type and have some answers. Not sure about those who picked 7. We'll let you in and we'll let you be part of this, but we're glad you're here. Don't go take a shower in the middle. See a lot of 2s. That's a good thing. A lot of 3s sitting there waiting, waiting in your house. I just saw 4. Kelly, I think I saw that pop by. I think 4 is kind of sweet, so that's a nice one. Fortunately, there's no 9s, although when people have picked 9 and told me, they said it's about laughing. I see it as kind of growling. So, all right. I'm going to move on. You can keep putting numbers in there. I want to get people thinking, getting you responding. And, by the way, this is something you could use in a board meeting if you had an online board meeting. It doesn't have to be dogs. It could be cats. It could be flowers. It could be pictures of seasons. But it's a great way. One thing I've learned about having online board meetings in this past 2 or 3 years is the concept of connect before content. And as you just see, we connected and it took about 2 minutes. just to get people kind of, where are you? Because, you know, right before they came into your meeting, they might have been in another meeting. They might have had a kid screaming. They might have had a police car drive by the front. So you just want to give people a minute to kind of get into your meeting. So thank you for all of your answers. I do see a lot of twos. I think that's good. Few of you are balancing the pencil on your nose. So I guess that means you're very focused. That's what I see that one as. All right, so let's move on here. Going to go inside some chunks. And the first chunk that we're going to talk about has to do with board development trends. Then I'm going to talk about governance, governing modes. Then we're going to roll into roles and responsibilities. That's a lot of information. As I said, you'll have a chance to see the slides afterwards. But I just want to give you some concepts, knowing that some of you probably have very well-developed boards and are really aware of all this information, and you might just pick a nugget or two that works for you. And some of you might be more at the beginning stages of forming a board. I make one assumption that makes it easier, which isn't true for everybody, but that you have a board and you have paid staff. Now, I'm going to talk about the difference between governance and management in the next kind of bucket, but I have to make some assumptions, and the idea that there are some paid staff at your nonprofit is kind of one I start with. So that just lets you know where we're having the conversation. So let's look at trends. There's 5 trends that are kind of apparent right now. And the idea, let's see. There you go. So the idea around composition is intentional and strategic composition. So we're not just trying to find board members by, you know, who do you know, who sat next to you at church on Sunday, who sat next to you at the PTA, who did you see in the grocery store line, but trying to be much more intentional about who we ask onto our board for purposes of diversity, of racial and demographics, for purpose of skill sets, for purpose of representation that might be by geography versus, you know, if you're statewide, you want people from the whole state. Even if you're one county, you may want people from the more rural areas opposed to the towns. So it's about, there's much more conversation about the importance and the need to be focused on composition. Often I hear, instead of the word nominating committee, I'm starting to see much more people using the word governance committee, which kind of looks at the life of the board member, not just recruiting them, which is kind of what nominating suggested. So governance is about how do we recruit, how do we support and build board members, and then how do we create rotation. So that's composition. Orientation. What I'm hearing here, what I would recommend is the idea of having a well thought through onboarding process, which does not mean you have to spend much, you know, tons of time. There's a little bit of investment time at the beginning, but then you have what you're going to use. So the idea of onboarding or orientation, I use those words back and forth, is how do you get people onto your board in a way they can be productive and effective? How do you give them the information they need? Don't just give them a 2-inch thick notebook that they have to read, but how do we start engaging board members with them? How do we start giving them different information? One way, if you have no idea where to start with, I suggest having a conversation with your board and saying, what is the one thing you wish you had known when you joined this board? And the people who are on your board will start giving you some ideas, and that will help you flesh out what direction you want to go. Number 3, education. This is the whole idea of board development, board education, ongoing board education, and not just about your mission, which is where I think a lot of people get focused and sometimes stopped. But what does it mean to be a board member? How to read the nonprofit finance sheet. Some of the smartest people in the world get on your board, and they have great professional experience, but they don't really understand some of this weird stuff that happens in the nonprofit world with reserve funds and restricted funds. And make sure your board members understand your budgeting process. So that's an educational piece. Make sure they understand what it means to be a board member. There's kind of an individual board member role. There is the role of the board as a whole, and then there's the organization. So there's a kind of 3 different angles to look at when you're wanting to onboard people to your organization. Evaluation. Now this is a trend, and what I'm telling you is it's not about, oh, you get an A and you get a B, but it's about somehow getting your board members to evaluate their work individually and the work of the board. So to do that, though, you have to have something to start with. So I suggest saying to all your board members, whether it's in January or whether your fiscal year might start in new board members in July, once a year you might have them sit down and write down, what is one goal you have as a board member this year? why are you on this board? What do you want to learn something? Do you want to try out, you want to try out for some leadership roles? Do you want to learn some new skill sets? What's one goal you have to be on this board this year? And then I would share everybody's goal with everybody so that everybody sees what other people want to learn. Because maybe I'm saying, well, I'm willing to learn a little bit more about fundraising. Or maybe my goal, it would be to truly understand what the balance sheet looks like. Let people see what each other, their goal is. 6 months in, ask people how you doing on your goal. So you're building in this reflection evaluation piece that says coming to the board and just sitting here at a meeting really isn't enough. We want you to come and participate and give something and learn something. And to learn something is kind of what you're going to take away, really. There's also the evaluation of the board as a whole. And it could be, what's the best thing we did as a board this year? What's one thing we as a board need to learn to do better? So you're starting to have these questions. It can be that kind of an informal process where you're starting to have questions and asking, how can we be a better board? How can I be a better board member? And in that, you're implying it's not about just coming and sitting down and being this person in a seat, but it's about moving along and contributing. And number 5, I think is a kind of interesting one to think about. And this goes to having an intentional recruitment process. What I would suggest is you're recruiting people to be on your board, you say, well, we have 2 or 3 year terms. And the first year, what we want when you're on the board is to be active, come to the meetings, pick a committee to be on, however you're organized. The second year, we'd like you to start taking a leadership role, maybe be head of a committee, maybe take on one of our special projects and be in partnership with somebody and be a co-leader. And if you come back the third year, or when you come back the third year, we'd like you to think about being one of the officers. So you're not promising that to somebody, but you're planting that seed early on so you don't have that board meeting where we're like, well, there's nobody that wants to be the president next year, because that happens. I know, I see some of you laughing right now. That happens. People are all sitting there and nobody wants to be the board president. Well, if we don't talk about it, but once a year, we're not kind of planting that seed. So the idea around leadership is letting people know it's a dynamic process, and that part of being on this board is you're going to develop skills, you're going to contribute back, and you're also going to be part of this dynamic process where we ask people to think about stepping forward each year. We're not waiting for the perfect president. We're helping them kind of move along as we go. So those are some trends I want you to think about as you are working with your board. You have them written there. You can decide which one means the most to you that you want to start working on. I'm going to stop it occasionally and ask you to say which one of these ideas kind of sticks out for you, but I'm going to keep going right now. I'll come back to this shortly. So the next thing I want to move into is the idea of governance modes. I don't want you to memorize words today. I want to give you some concepts to think about so that you can start looking at your board differently. So the idea of governance modes is there's 3 modes you need from boards, kind of models of a way of thinking, frameworks. And it's fiduciary, strategic, and generative. And before your eyes pop out and you're like, oh, don't worry, just kind of go with the flow and listen. So fiduciary is the piece people are most familiar with. The fiduciary would be the oversight piece. This is the more black and white part of being on a board, where you know what you're doing is right, you know what you're doing is wrong, you're balancing your budget. That's good. Lots of boards know, people come onto boards and they understand that's part of it. The strategic is getting more into direction setting, making choices, which is part of what a board does. They help make decisions for the organization. Should we expand to this county over here? Should we work with 5th and 6th graders as well as K to 4? You know, those kind of decisions. Do we need to pull back in? Do we need to grow out? So those kind of decisions. And generative is more in the, well, you might have heard the concept of upstream and downstream. It's kind of looking at the whole environment that you exist in and the meaning making. Why are you doing what you're doing? So there's organizations that have been around 100 years, and they need to say, why are we doing what we're doing? That's Girl Scouts, YMCA, Red Cross. Some of those need to rethink. Just because we were doing it in 1999 doesn't mean it's relevant now, or maybe we need to do it differently. Technology means some issues have gone away and some new ones have come in. So the idea of generative is more of the meaning making side. So let me explain each of these a little bit more. Fiduciary, you're identifying problems. Because you're looking at the budget and making sure it's going right. You're making sure you're spending your money, that you're following the law, that we're doing what we're supposed to be doing. And it's not always about looking for problems, but it's making sure when you identify them, that you've seen them and you're going to take care of them. And strategic gets more into solving the problems. Are we going to expand? Are we going to stay smaller? Are we going to be going into more pathways? Or are we going to stay with the path we're on? And then generative gets into looking at the idea of how do we frame our problems. And that's what changes over time. I mean, my background is at one point I worked at Girl Scouts at their national headquarters. And I use that example now because what's going on in the Girl Scouts and Boy Scouts world is the Boy Scouts have decided to rethink who members can be. So that means now Girl Scouts have to rethink. It also means with a lot of younger people these days, the idea of gender, it has a different meaning and a feeling for them. So whether you want to or not, if you're an organization, you have to rethink that because that's who your audience is. So that's kind of what generative is. Do we need to rethink what's going on? So we have fiduciary, strategic, and generative. Now, here's what I would say to you about these. You don't have to memorize these words. But the idea is you want a board that can operate in all of these modes, but not necessarily every board meeting and not necessarily in every quarter. You might be in a point where you need to really dig down into fiduciary and get all your pieces lined up well. Strategic is more than just the strategic plan. It's just thinking strategically. It's making sure the strategic plan is part of your conversation and not just this beautiful thing that you did that you never look at. No. Yes, that happens. And then generative is the idea of sometimes this comes out in once a year you have a board retreat and you spend time at those bigger issues and not just on the monthly or quarterly issues where you have the agenda where you're just kind of working your way down. So sometimes people get to generative there. So these are the three modes as a way for you to think about how are you getting your board to not just get stuck on the fiduciary, because that's where people tend to get stuck. Now, I'm not saying any of them are better. You could have a lot of really great creative thinkers who are really good at the generative, but they're not really good at fiduciary. So you kind of need a little bit of people in all. The generative might be harder for people to think about, but when you're operating in all these modes, you kind of move to a higher level of working with your board, and it's not just kind of sitting there and repeating yes or no, up and down, eat lunch at the meeting, go home. It's more of getting into the deeper discussion. So the next one we're moving into now is the idea of board roles and responsibilities. This is a bigger chunk than the other two. Basically, there's 3 buckets that you put the roles into. And under that comes some responsibilities. You don't need to be writing down all the 10 responsibilities, but I just want you to hear that there are 10, and I'm going to talk to you about all of these. So what we're going to start at is look at the 3 kind of umbrella roles that boards play. What they do is the board establishes the organizational identity. Number 2, they provide oversight. And number 3, they ensure resources. Well, this probably makes sense to you because, and I'm going to break them down. The organizational identity has to do with who we are and what we're about, and providing oversight. You know that word, and you've heard a bunch about that. And then ensuring resources is making sure we have what we need. But inside of each of these, there's some more specific responsibilities. But this is overall what boards do. Now, some of you may come from the point of view where your board is still very involved in the day-to-day. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit later, the idea of a working board versus a governing board. And what does that mean? Because I hear working board a lot. But we're going to stay here with just the roles and then the responsibilities as they roll out. So here's the first one, establish organizational identity. So the 2 responsibilities that come under that is 1, determine the mission, and 2, ensure effective planning. Well, once you have the mission, it's done. So why does that stay relevant? Occasionally you need to go back and look at it. Maybe every, 3, 4, 5 years, you just want to say, is this still relevant? I mean, there are many organizations because of technology have really had to change. There was a lot of nonprofits that had crisis telephone lines. Nobody uses that anymore. So they had to switch over, and was a nonprofit created once called a crisis text line because nobody was calling, they were texting, and they were changing what they were about. So sometimes you need to change your mission. As I said, Boy Scouts clearly rethought their mission, which had been to work solely with boys, and they have changed it to boys and girls. Other nonprofits bring it in, bring it out. You need to rethink your mission every so often. It's not just carved in stone. However, it is in your bylaws, and it is in whatever paperwork you have submitted to get your IRS nonprofit status. So if you change your mission, ultimately it's something the board has to vote on. So I put this one under board responsibility because you know, the staff could do a lot of research and say, we need to change to where we're rescuing cats and dogs and not just cats. And here's our research and here's our reason why. But the staff alone can't change that. They need to take it to the board, and the board needs to vote on it, because the nature of a nonprofit is it's not owned by one person. It's owned in a sense by the board. They're the collective and representing for the rest of us. So it's not one staff member that can say we need to change, even though they may have the great idea, but you have to work through the board. So that's why it's a board responsibility. They are the ones that would determine the mission, but they're not going to lock the door and do it without talking to staff. But it's a board final vote. And then number two, ensure effective planning. It is the board's responsibility to make sure that there is planning. And often, that, as I said, that seems to be done in the sense of we do a strategic plan, but then we don't look at the plan. So what I would say to board members would be, you need to ensure that we're using a process to go back and look at our strategic plan, that we're operating from a planning mode and not just, oh, here's money, let's go that direction. Now, the pandemic probably threw everything out of a little bit of sorts. But still, there's the idea that you need to think down the line and say, as board members, where are we going with this? Why are we making these decisions? How are this benefiting us? So let me just share with you a sample question for each one of these. So my picture for number one is the two doors, and it's the mission of kind of determining which side, you know, we're the blue door, we're the yellow doors. Who are you? So you're determining that. How does the board ensure the mission is reflected in programs? Now, I'm not giving you the answer. That's a question I think your board should talk about. How do you as a board? It's going to vary according to the size and history of your organization. So not only how does, but how can the board ensure? And this doesn't mean the board needs to go out and do research and write papers. It could mean we look at this report. It could mean we access this data. It could mean a staff member comes in and tells us certain metrics, certain stories. Your board should have a way to ensure that the mission is reflected in the programs, not on the daily basis, but on the big picture level. And then the second one is planning. A good question is, are the strategic priorities reflected in the annual budget? Because sometimes budgets seem to be very disconnected from the planning. We put all this money in certain areas, but yet the plan said we were going to go this way. So a good question for board members to start asking and looking at is, how are our priorities reflected in the budget, and are the strategic priorities that we've established, you know, if we want to be known in the community for doing a certain action, are we putting our money in a way that makes that happen? If we want to be known within our focus group area, you know, we work with, like I said, cats and dogs. We like to be known throughout the region as the best cat and dog rescue. Or what are we doing to put money into making sure we have better practices than we perhaps used to have? So just some questions. We're looking at 1 and 2. Now I'm going to take you to the next umbrella, which is provide oversight. Again, oversight seems to be something people are pretty clear about. And if I break this down, 3, 4, 5, and 6, it comes down to people, reputation, money, and reputation through integrity. So let me talk about that. So you're supporting, number 3 is you're supporting or evaluating the CEO or / executive director. Those titles are, depends on the organization. CEO is the same thing as executive director, if you hear me talking today. So how does the board, it is the role of the board to support and evaluate the executive director. Now, this isn't done like the same way they might do it in a corporation or even a business, but you just need to have a process. For supporting, I would say, I would ask the executive director, how can we as a board support you? And see what kind of conversation you get into. As far as evaluation, there should be some sort of process. It should be in writing, so it's not just a good idea, but it's actually an idea that's been approved by the board. So something in writing that describes the process of how we evaluate the CEO. I find the biggest challenge here is board members think, okay, I'm a volunteer and I don't really have expertise, and I'm evaluating this executive director who's been in the role 10 years and has degrees and 40, what can we do? Well, it doesn't have to be like the corporate world where it's, you know, one down. It could be more of a partnership conversation, because executive directors would love to have a board that wants to support them. And then on a kind of a basic level, you could start with, executive director, what are the top 3 accomplishments you had this year? And what are the 2 areas where you would most like support? And start with a conversation there, so that you are in a sense, evaluating and supporting the CEO. Maybe not all board members are part of that conversation. Sometimes it might just be a committee. It might be the executive director picks one board member and the president picks one board member, and but that's what you have written down. That's what you will decide in your nonprofit is, how are we going to do this? And if you're a board member, you want to make sure this happens, because the downside of some of these, that when they don't happen, is the minute you have this major crises, everybody just kind of goes crazy. And the point of doing a lot of these roles and being aware of them is so when you have that crisis, it might be a little less crazy and not everything hitting the wall at the same time. So number 4, monitor and strengthen programs and services. This is a curious one for me. This is the one where board members are really most likely to jump into and just be really involved with and sticking their fingers in it, and just because that's why people join your board. They love what you're doing as a program or service. But the role as a board member, not as a person or somebody who's interested, but as a board member, your role is to ensure that somehow we're monitoring and strengthening the programs and the services, but from a higher level than just kind of that daily, what do we do on Tuesday? How many people did we feed? So it's more, is there a process? How does it get shared with the board? How do we know that what we're doing is better than it used to be? Where do we know where the improvement is? Those higher level questions that board members can ask. Where people get stuck is they get stuck, and board members come in with expertise. I have a cat, so I have all the answers about cat rescue. I have a dog, so I have all the answers about dog rescue. And we get stuck in how many cups of food we give them each day. That's not a board question. The board question would be, how are we effectively providing for the animals or the humans or the charges of our organization? Number 5, protecting assets, providing financial oversight. This is not about fundraising, but this is about taking care of the money after you get it. This is where you want to make sure people understand kind of your cash, your money flow. We get this much from government. We get this much from corporations. We get this much from private donations. What's restricted versus unrestricted? What is, multi-year grants? All these words, helping your board members understand that it's very different than the hamburger stand where you just sell your hamburgers, get the money, reinvest the money, it's a different process. So you need to help people by talking to them. And I don't mean having a CPA come in and give a 45-minute discussion, because that still might be beyond people, but break it down into ask your people what questions they have. What are the FAQs about your budget, and just answer one question at every board meeting or every other board meeting. Have a 5 or 10-minute conversation about what does it mean to provide financial oversight. Number 6, ensure legal and ethical integrity. Well, that's pretty clear. If you're on a board, you want to make sure you're following the law. But you need to help your people understand what are the laws that you have, whether they're city laws or state laws. There might be laws around how many adults need to be in the room with so many children, those kind of rules, how far apart beds need to be if that's what you do. So you need to help your board members understand some of the laws that you have to follow. But then the ethical integrity has to do with how transparent do you want to be as an organization. Many organizations have chosen to be more transparent now than they used to be because of social media. You can tell behind the scenes stories. Ethical integrity could be how we make decisions. You could ask board members. One of my favorite things to tell people to get board members involved would be to have all your board members take a small piece of talking about why are they on this board. And what you have them do is you get your smartphone out here and you get everybody to do a little video, 30-second video. And it could be, hey, I'll use my phone, I'll show you. Hey, I'm Jean Allen, I'm on the board of ABC, and this is the best thing we've done this year, or this is why I'm on this board. So it's a very kind of transparent behind the scenes. People can see who's on your board, and have different board members do a 30-second video, and then you can use that information to put on your social media. So you're showing your board members personality. You're not asking them to go in a corner and make it. You can work with people and make sure they say some right words, but that's kind of the ethical integrity, who we are, how we make decisions, where we get our money from, how we make sure as a board that we're operating in a legal and ethical way. That your donors would love to see that, your members, your funders, but it's just kind of an honest conversation. So here's some questions around those areas. Kind of covered number 3. It should be, if you're new on a board, you should ask this question, but beyond there should be, is it right in writing? Meaning, is the process in writing? let's say I'm a great board chair and we do evaluations as a CEO, and we do it for 2 years while I'm the board chair, and then I leave and nobody knows what to do because it wasn't in writing, because I was just really good at it. And I just made it happen. So part of being a good board is taking those good processes and starting to write them down. So even if the next year after me, you become the board chair, you can do it a different way, but at least have the notes from mine or the process to make changes. Number 4, how do we monitor the progress towards program goals? We as a board, not we as potential staff members or former volunteers, but what's the board level of looking at programs? You as an executive director could take it and hand it to people. You as a board chair could just, but I'm saying have a conversation and kind of determine what level does your board need to know about programs, and help them understand they really don't want to spend their time looking at the very low level and everyday questions. They want to look at what you need from them is those higher level. That's the position they're on. A board is your business, is a business entity. They are your representatives. So you don't want them getting stuck in the mud, as we say, or stuck in the weeds of program. Number 5, do they understand financial health? I think you ought to create some, if you do online meetings still with your board, do some polls and just see, because that's anonymous. Anonymous is good to get kind of a sense of how people understand your financials. Ask a couple of questions and have people answer them, even if you meet in person. Figure out a way to do it anonymously so you can get a sense of, do your people understand your budgeting process? And maybe your president does, but nobody else does. So how do you even get a sense of how they understand so that you can then start sharing information? And a great question for your board would be, how do we exemplify transparency and accountability? I mean, I gave you some ideas about the video. Some groups put their 990 online. I know you can go and get them online, but it usually takes 2 or 3 years to get them onto Gold Star, which has another name now. And you can put your 990 on your web page right now. That's a way to show transparency. You can share parts of your budget. You don't have to share details, but you can share. I see some groups put out their big goals of their strategic plan, so that in some ways they're asking people to hold us accountable. This is what we want to do, but you don't have to put all your details of how you're going to do it and when you're going to do it. But you could just say, over the next couple of years, these are our goals. So those are some ways to think about how you can exemplify transparency and accountability. So let's move to the last umbrella, which is ensure resources. Ensure resources, I think of it as number 7 is human resources, number 8 is money resources, number 9 again is human resources, and number 10 is reputational resources. So if you want to think of it that way, you as a board you want to help enhance and ensure adequate resources. So by selecting a CEO, you're making sure we have the right leader. I don't spend a lot of time on that, because most boards, hopefully you don't have to do it every year. So what you do is you have board members who once every 3 or 4 or 5 years, but you should have some sort of general succession plan that helps you with this. I hear more and more from funders that they want to know that you're going to still be around if your executive director leaves. So a general succession plan is becoming something that is, general meaning kind of the steps you would take, not necessarily who you're going to hire or who you're going to advertise with, but just what would you do as a board if you got a phone call that your executive director got another job and is moving to California in 3 weeks? Or in the sad case, your executive director gets very ill or dies, and then you don't even have the memory. So that's what a succession plan should help you with. Number 8 has to do with fundraising. Some boards are fundraising boards, some are not. Some get 85% of their money from government contracts, and the other 15% might be from fee for services. And some might be family foundations where they're giving money away. So somebody might come be on your nonprofit board, and they've been on another nonprofit board and they didn't have to fundraise. So you should define to people in your interview process where you're bringing people on your board, what is your expectation from board members in terms of participating or even giving? In the arts world, they can sometimes, in bigger cities, they can ask people to give $5,000 or $10,000 before they're even considered to be on the board. Now I find that's only true for, symphonies in big cities. Most of us would not be thinking that way for our nonprofit boards. But if you're thinking people should give 100 or 1,000, you should say, well, this is the average. Now, the challenge I see with some people is they want to bring a wide range of economic level to their board. So what you might want to think about then is having a collective board fundraising goal, and to say the board collectively have them write down how much money they could help bring in and add it together. And if your 10-member board says they could bring in $12,000, they don't have to know that one person said 2,000 and one person said $50. Only you could have one person who tracks that. And so you have a collective board goal as opposed to individuals. You're going to make that work by the way that you think about it. Build a competent board. That's my favorite because I like board building. But the idea is your people can help build a board. And they can do that by looking at some of the ways what are the skill sets we have? What are some of the representation we have? How do we become a better board? I gave you the idea of how to evaluate. If you start looking at how can I contribute as a board member? How do we do as a board? You're starting to look at building a competent board. One of my ideas here has to do with onboarding, the idea of a board buddy. And I give you a little bit different hint on that. What I say is, as soon as you vote in your new board members, let's say you vote in 3 new board members, I would say we need 3 volunteers who will be their board buddy. And here's what a board buddy does. 1, within the next day, I want you to call them up and just say, hey, Caroline, welcome to the board. So happy you're here. I'm Jean, I'm on the board. And we're just going to have a few minutes of a conversation. But I'm not doing the onboarding. I'm just greeting because that person just got voted on the board and they haven't heard anything. I mean, I have friends who talk about, oh, I can't wait, I'm going to be on this board, and they're so excited, and then they never hear anything. So first thing you do is you call them up. That's number 1. On that phone call, then what I would say to that person is, I'm going to introduce you at the first meeting. How would you like me to introduce you? Because some people have a family life, and some people have a work life, and some people have a service life with other organizations, or somebody's new to the area. Just what are 3 or 4 things that you would like me to say about you? So then I'm going to introduce this person at the meeting. And if it's in person, then I'm going to say, when you get there, come sit next to me. I'm going to save you a seat. If it's on Zoom, then you just introduce them on Zoom. But what you're doing is you're pulling other board members in from the beginning, because I'm now kind of bringing this person in. So I've called them up, I've introduced them. And then the last thing I do is after that first meeting, I say, let's set a time and let me call you the next week, like 15 minutes. So you call them up and you say, just want to kind of review with you about our meeting. Was there jargon we used that didn't make sense? Maybe we used Robert's rules and it didn't make sense to you. Maybe we didn't use Robert's rules and that didn't make sense. So we just kind of, I catch you up, give you an overview, check in with you. And then I say, well, you're on your own now. I mean, I'll be around. Feel free to call me, but everybody on the board's willing to help you. Just want to be there at the beginning. Now, the reason I say do it that way is too many of the times I see these board buddies and it's for 6 months or a year and people kind of stop doing it after about 3 months and then they feel lousy. So if you give board members stuff, give them a very concrete small step, because then I can say, hey, I did those 3 pieces. I called, I introduced, and I called back and I'm done. And I wouldn't partner people based on similarities or differences. It would just totally random. But I wouldn't don't let friends introduce friends. Let somebody new, just so it's another person they're meeting. So that's my little nugget for you under board buddies, under competent board. And then number 10, enhance the organization's public standing. This is where you as a board member is expected to advocate, to be an ambassador and an advocate for the mission. And that could mean having talking points so that when you run into somebody in a grocery store, you know how to say what your board does. It could mean going to the city council and stating a position that your board has voted on. It could mean writing a letter. It could mean getting other people to write letters. So you want your board members to have that role. So what is a question for all of these? Well, I mentioned, is there a succession plan? That's important. And if you have one, kind of look at it every 2 or 3 years because things change. How do you expect people to fundraise? How much money? Just be clear so people they know what they're getting into. Number 9, how does your board ensure the composition reflects needs? Often what happens with boards, when they start to see how they can do some strategic recruiting, they get boards that are very exciting. But prior to that, we tend to invite people we know. And it's either by race or by age or by profession or by, the religious group I'm in. We tend to have a lot of similarities. So part of what you want to talk about is, how do we make sure our composition reflects our needs? And those needs could be either we want to represent who we serve, we want to represent our community, or we want to make sure we have just a wide range. We think our issue speaks to everybody. So we want to make sure that we have a lot of different faces out here. And then number 10 would be, how does the board review information, how do we get information so that we know what the organization's reputation is? So what are we relying upon? i.e., how do we talk to stakeholders or learn from stakeholders? Stakeholders could be members, stakeholders could be people who've enjoyed our services, could be people in the community. So what we have there is 10 responsibilities that fell under 3 umbrellas. So this is another way for you to look at it. It's a lot of words, but we're also I'm talking about doing a couple of trainings for you where we dig down a little bit deeper into this. So this is just kind of the appetizer that tells you these are all there. We're talking about doing something that would dig a little deeper into all these, how you could use these in a board meeting, how you could have conversations. So for right now, I just want you to hear 3 big roles and 10 responsibilities. Okay, I'm going to take a break and take a swallow, but I want you to do some work now. I want you to look at these 3 slides. So this is what we've talked about so far. A is the idea of trends, and that was 5 ideas there. B was the idea of 3 governance modes and getting your board to think and act in different modes. And C was the idea, it was that big chunk, but it was the 3 umbrellas of the roles and then the responsibilities. So just put one of these into the chat box, A, B, or C, that you feel like speaks to you the strongest for right now. You know, you're like, wow, I got something I can run with. So either A, B, or C, and put that in the chat box, and let's see where people go. Well, I do see a lot of C's, see some A. I see a Fran put A in there. See a bunch of C's. Well, I'm glad you're looking at C and that it's meaningful to you. As I said, we're going to do some more. We're thinking about doing a longer workshop where we can dig into these a little more so that you could have more clarity of how you could make these work with your board. Not just here are the 10 responsibilities, but just kind of like with the board buddy, what are some little ways you can start making these things work? I think C is definitely winning the race today. I do see B, see A. I'm glad people like the trends and the modes. I think all of this is valuable. So thank you very much. At least we know all of you who are putting something in there is awake. That's always good. You know, we got to keep people awake here. I'm still seeing mostly C's and some A's. Okay. So I want to move on to the next area that I was going to talk about. These are just kind of some ideas. The first part was the kind of, like I said, the bones. These are just some ideas that I wanted to make sure when you were talking about boards, you had these ideas. So often people talk about management versus governance. So I want to be kind of clear on what that means. I want to talk about board. Board is a word. I'm going to talk about that. And then how do boards get work done? So let's go to the first one. I'm going to give you a visual. Some of you like visuals. Some of you are like, oh, I hate this part. But you know, you got words in the last part. So we're doing visuals right now. So governance is the yellow box. And the visual behind this to help you understand governance versus management is it's a big picture of the organization. And it's the 30-foot, 300-foot view, or the drone view, if you want to think of it that way, where if you look at this picture, you can see where retail becomes transportation, and then it becomes the trees, and then it becomes the umbrellas, and where people are sitting on the beach, and where people are maybe even in the water. So basically, you're looking at some data points, and you're looking at trends. So that's what boards want to do, is look at the big picture of the organization. You know, where are people on the beach? Where are we putting our umbrellas versus where the roads are? You know, so it's patterns and it's data points from that high view. And we contrast that with being on the beach. And that's what is more the management. So they're in the work. They're doing the work. I mean, you can see the details here that somebody's wearing yellow shirt and somebody else is wearing yellow shorts. You can see people are standing around talking. But the point I want to give to you is the idea that management is more in the moment of doing the work. Operational is another word we use, making it happen. And that governance is more looking at the big picture, making those big picture decisions, where the road should go, where we should place the umbrellas, what are the patterns, what are the data points that we're getting. So when people talk about governance, they're talking more about policy. And when people talk about management or operations, they're talking more about procedures. So board members help create policies. And then the staff and the executive director and the operational side is to make the procedures that support the policies. So a policy might be how much vacation time people get. The reason that's a board decision is because that's a money decision. You know, if you can hold vacation for 5 years, then we owe money to people for 5 years for unused vacation. So that's a financial decision. So that they could say, the board could pass a policy that says how long vacation time can be held. Now, it's probably in conversation with the executive director. But then the executive director is the one who has to monitor people and make sure that people are taking vacation time and using it up. So just giving you an example. So policy, procedure, big picture versus hands in. So governing is what boards do. And operations is what staff does. So that moves kind of into the next one, which is I wanted to talk about. Oh, I'll give you this example, then I'll move to my next one. So this is another way to think about the board's role. So on the left side, boards need to be nosy. So they need to stick their noses in and ask questions. Where did that money come from? Where did that money go? How are we going to fund this? Did we get as much money from that as we expected to get? Do we need to move money around? So I'm sticking with money issues, but you want your board to be nosy. But the second part of that is fingers out. And the idea behind that is so that they don't get stuck in the weeds and the small pictures. So you want them to be nosy, but you want them to also have their fingers out. It's an interesting balance. It's a constant balance. It's a conversation you can have with your boards to help people understand. And it'd be great if a board member is willing to help lead it. You know, what is nosy in our nonprofit? What do we mean by that? When we want our board members to stick their noses in and be curious is really the other way I would describe it. We want board members to be curious. We do not want, you don't really want board members who are going to come and just sit there and eat lunch and go home. You want them to ask good questions. Fingers out, you want people to not get involved in how we're doing all the details. So now I'm going to take you into the next piece, which is board. And what I want to say, a couple things I want to say about board. What I see in some nonprofits is they have advisory boards, and they have young people's board, and they use the word board for everything. And when you do that, people don't know what the board is because they just see the board everywhere. So I would recommend you use the word board one time, and that's for the board that has the legal authority to make decisions, to hire the executive director, to vote on the budget. And every other group you have, I would call them advisory or committee or council of smart people or just council, but call them words other than board. Because what happens, particularly people say, well, we're going to have a young people's board, young professionals board, so they can learn about being on the board, except they don't learn about oversight because they're not doing it. They don't learn about legal integrity because they have nothing to do with it. All they're doing is coming, eating lunch, and being told they're supposed to go fundraise. So that's what they learn what boards are about. So instead, you could have a young nonprofit, a young professionals advisory group. Sometimes people want to have groups with former clients, or they want to put clients on the board. And I am not going to say you should or shouldn't do that, but I think you should be clear and think through that you have a business entity, and you want to make sure you're not putting people on your board who would feel awkward. So if you have a board made up of people who are professionals, and then you bring in your clients then it becomes like an inner and outer circle. There are ways you can do it very successfully, but you need to be very intentional about it. Sometimes you can get what you need by having a client advisory council, and they come in and they might meet with the board 2 or 3 times a year, or they meet with one board member and they get advice. Because if what you want is advice and input from former clients, think about that. What I don't want you to do is put former clients on the board and they feel awkward because they're the only person from that part of town or from that religion or from that economic level, and they stand out somehow and they feel like they're one down. So you can do it, just be very intentional on how you want to do it and make sure people don't feel awkward about that. Then I made a note here because I wanted to make sure I talked about working boards versus governing boards. And I would argue with you, or debate perhaps, that all boards are governing boards, and some are also working boards. So those of you who might be at the beginning of a nonprofit organization and you say, we have a working board, usually what people mean is our boards have to do everything. They have to do the operations as well as the governance. They have to go out and do the program. They have to raise money. They have to write the grants because there's no staff. And that's usually at the beginning stage of a nonprofit, the first phase. And they say, we have a working board. And I would debate with those people that you still have a governing board. You can't not do the governing pieces. What you're doing is governing and doing the working piece, because you need your boards to do the governing pieces. You need them to provide oversight. You need them to provide adequate resources. You need them to make sure that you are establishing a strong organizational identity. So they can't give up on that, because they have to write the grants, do the program, open the doors to the program, lock the doors, because there's no staff. The way I've seen nonprofits work with that is you could either create some kind of double columned agenda when you have your board meetings, so you're clear when you're doing the governing piece, and then you're clear when you're stepping into the working piece. Or you could have the first half hour of your meeting is only look at governing, and the second half hour, then you start over again and you look at the operational piece. The reason I say that is sooner or later, your organization may grow to the point where you have staff, and you need your board to understand what the governing pieces are, because they'll give up the operational pieces, but a board always owns the governing pieces. So that's working boards versus governing boards. And then the idea of using the word board one time. So those are the pieces I wanted to kind of make sure you heard at that point. All right, so let me see. Next piece would be, how do boards get their work done? So here are some common ways. And I'm going to talk about each one for a minute or two. So we got meetings, we have committees, we have individual work. Meetings, board meetings. I had an executive director call me up one time and say, I don't know what to do. I used to be on the staff, and there was an executive director. The executive director left, and I got hired. And all the former executive director ever asked of these board members was to come to the meetings. And so we have a very good board who comes to the meetings, they eat lunch, and they go home, and they do nothing else. Because basically they had trained that board that that's what a board member was. Come to the meeting, eat lunch, go home. And they didn't do some of these other pieces. So your meetings can be interactive. I mean, we found some great ways to be interactive with Zoom. Actually, we use Google Docs, we use Google Slides, chat box. There's a lot of ways, and breakout groups. Well, I mean, I did a board retreat with a group online, and they said it was the best retreat ever. You know why? Because they talked to each other, and they weren't used to talking to each other, even in person. So I'm saying your board wants to talk to each other. So figure out a way to have your meetings where you can have more interaction and not just reporting out. If all you're doing at your board meetings is reporting out what committees are doing, you are not using your time wisely, because people could read those reports. Or you could say, all you really need to hear from committees is, what are they recommending? Where we're spending money, where their actions. I don't need to know what decision went on and where they met and every decision. Just what are they recommending? So you got to teach people how to give a report. The story I heard once was a group didn't know what to do, so they assigned the committee reports for the end of the meeting, because people really want to leave on time, so they knew they wouldn't take up too much time. So that's another way you could do it. So meetings, we want to look at meetings and talk about how we can get more people involved in meaningful ways. How we can, just the idea of the board buddy, where I'm introducing somebody, becomes different people talking. How do we get people to have discussions? A suggestion I have come up with often is, if you're going to make a decision, you could assign, if you're in person, this half of the room, we want you to have a discussion, either in small groups or the whole table, that side of the table, about 3 reasons why we shouldn't do this. And this side of the room, 3 reasons why we should. Because then what you're doing is you're separating opinion from position. Because maybe I wanted to do it and I was put on the side to determine why we're not going to do it. But in doing that, you're kind of elevating the discussion into looking at points of view as opposed to just opinions. You're also, what happens a lot in boards is the person who's seen with the most expertise is the one that's listened to the strongest. And that could be by age, length of time on the board, degrees. It could be my expertise. And that once that person speaks, everybody just goes along with them. I have really had people tell me they're on a board and they vote whatever way the treasurer votes. Yikes. I mean, the treasurer probably does understand, but you're kind of giving over your role if that's what you do. So you want to help people understand that piece about asking questions and being curious. So I try to teach people to say, What are the questions we need to ask? Because I think you're using board members' intelligence and energy a lot better if you're saying them, what are the questions we need to ask? And going from that, you could share the questions on Post-its. Then you could pick out what are the top 3 questions that we all, and just vote on it, using dots, using some kind of voting method, and pick the top 3 questions you think your board should talk about. And then you can have a deeper discussion when it's about an issue. Should we do something? Well, what are the questions we should ask as a board? And then what are the top questions we should talk about? So what you're doing is making your meetings a little more meaningful. It doesn't have to be a 45-minute long discussion. It can be short. The other idea for meetings would be what we call a mission moment. Again, people have all sorts of ideas around mission moment. Sometimes people think about mission moment as having a client come in. The side of that I would challenge you on is sometimes those stories are so compelling, they go on for 30 minutes and then that's half your board meeting. So what I suggest, because I always like to think about how do we get board members more involved, I would say have a board member share their mission moment at every meeting and give them 2 minutes or 3 minutes and say, I'm going to start my phone and put it on 3 minutes, and when it rings, you're done. So you got to speak in 3 minutes. So it's not taking up a lot of time, and you can assign different board members each meeting 6 months out. And here's some of the things they could do. 1, they could go observe a program during that time. 2, they could sit with the executive director who's doing a fundraising phone call. Or they could sit with observe somehow a staff member who's doing an exit interview with a client. So they can observe some program, and then they come back and say to the board members, hey, this is what I experienced. This is what I saw. They could look through your Facebook postings and see pictures that are meaningful to them and ask questions. They could read a grant that you submitted and say, here's what I learned from reading that grant. There's a lot more work done writing a grant than I could imagine. These staff really work hard. So what you're doing is you're getting board members, they're kind of moving into putting their fingers in the work, but they're not doing it. They're just kind of getting out there and observing it and coming back and sharing at the board meeting. Here's my mission moment. It could be 2 board members go together to observe something, and they come back and share their conversation. So be creative and think of mission moment as a way to get your board members engaged. Do it at the beginning of your meeting. And here's my hint. Start with the board member you know will do it well, because you really want a good example first. You don't want the person who's going to speak for 20 minutes. And you don't want the person who is really resisting. Get somebody who talk to them before the meeting. And somebody who's, pretty good at following directions, pretty good at, doing that, and getting them to be the first one. So then you just start having that at every meeting, and it's just a way to start changing your meetings, because you're getting your board members talking to each other, and you're not just having them come in and sit. There's also the whole concept of consent agendas, which if you don't use that, you should write it down and Google it. And if you do use it, congratulations. Consent agendas are really what school boards use and city councils use, where the items that don't need to be discussed are put together and all voted on together. Committees that some people have written in their bylaws. I don't think this is true anymore, like 16 committees. You don't want 16 committees in your bylaws, because then you're liable for them. What you would like to do is, generally what I see is a governance committee, and as I said, they're leaning more towards being that kind of the life of a board member, not just recruiting and nominating, but it's about helping with the recruiting, helping with that board education piece, and then making sure we're doing some sort of offboarding or term limits. So that's the governance committee. There's usually some kind of financial committee that oversees the finances, that looks at that. There could be a fundraising committee, and sometimes there's an executive committee. Executive committees have to be written in your bylaws if you have one. Typically, it means it's the officers who come together. The downside of executive committees is sometimes they become the inner crew and everybody else feels like they're the outside and they're not important. So if you're going to have an active executive committee, you have to do it well in a way that doesn't take all the power and everybody else just feels like they're just there to be the extra votes. Typically, executive committees should be there to meet and make decisions between board meetings that are when it's hard to get all the staff, all the board members together. So everybody can't come in to get this information. I mean, I've seen it work well, I've seen it work bad. So just, if you have an executive committee, just be aware you don't want to leave people on the outside who feel like they're not important because they're not on that committee, because all the real decisions get made at the executive committee. Look at your bylaws and see how many committees are written. The other thing, after about 3 or 4 committees, often it says other committees as needed on an ad hoc basis. So you're not being held responsible for having all these committees. And the third thing that happens with boards is there's individual work, and you need to let people know that there's individual work where they can develop their own skill sets, where they can be representatives of the organization. But the key behind being a representative is you have to, the board, I can't just decide to go speak at the city council and decide I'm going to represent ABC nonprofit because I'm on the board. If I'm going to speak and say that I'm on ABC's board, they need to know that I'm speaking on that issue, because if they haven't voted on it, I can't, if I can't go to the city council and say, we can't put that highway there because all these, it's going to tear down all these trees. And oh, by the way, I'm on the board of ABC and DEF and XYZ. Well, unless those nonprofits voted, I can't go represent them. But there is individual work where I could go to city councils and hear what are the issues and bring them back to the board, or I could go to the read other information that's relevant to the mission and bring it back, or I could read the grants that we submit so that I understand what's going on. I could learn to read budget sheets from a nonprofit. So there's individual work as well as committee work and coming to the meetings. Man, this sounds like a lot you're asking people to do. But if you're stating it out there, you're just telling people it's not like I have to spend hours a week doing individual work. And if you want me to do fundraising, there might be some of that where I'm doing it with partnership with other people, and there might be some fundraising where I come on my own. If in fact, what I've seen that works real well in some nonprofits is they create like a menu for people who come on their board, and we want you to do things in each column. And one column might be fundraising ideas, and we want you to do one. And one column might be committee, and you need to pick one committee that you're on and what it means to be on that committee. And one column might be areas of expertise. And so it's kind of a menu, and you want one from each column or several, or then you use that at the end of the year to look at. I mean, people have told me they do this. They sit down with each board member and they say, how did you do on this column this year? Where did you feel like you excelled? You want to move away from the fact that you're begging somebody to be on your board to the idea that you are offering an opportunity for them to be connected and make a difference. Particularly coming out of this pandemic, I think people really want to make a difference in their community, and they don't know how to. And their community could be the state, the country, it could be, like I said, cats and dogs. There's some area that everybody wants to make a difference in, and they want to interact with people, even if we have to have Zoom meetings occasionally. So if you're thinking that you're offering people an opportunity to provide a little more meaning in their life, then it's okay to say we have meetings, and here's what we do, and you need to be at the meetings. And we have committees we'd like everybody to be on, and have some definition of what the committee that would be. And then here's some individual work that we either need from you or you can do. So let me see where I am on this. I think I have another piece I want to talk about. I kind of alluded to this a bit. So we have somebody looking in the rear view mirror here. And what I would say is, where is your focus? Because a board's power lies in the future. Boards can't spend a lot of time changing what's already happened. Their power is in the future. So if our board meetings are made up of listening to a lot of committee reports, that's stuff that's already happened. You want to gradually be able to move to where your board meetings are about the focus is on the future. How can we make a difference? How can we improve? How can we grow bigger or more impactful or more influential? How can we be the best nonprofit that does what we're doing? Whatever it is that's your goal. I don't think bigger is always better, but you might want to be most impactful. You might want to be a thought leader amongst your group of nonprofits that do the same work. It's up to you to decide how you want to use your reputation as a nonprofit. But if you want your board to help you, you got to have them focused somewhat on the future. And that's really where you're going to get more engaged board members, and that's where you're going to get more engagement of your board members, because there's not a lot to do if I'm sitting there listening to committee reports. It's very passive. It's very just ho-hum. But if we're kind of thinking about directions for the future, or how can we improve our ability as a board to be fundraisers or to be advocates and ambassadors? How can we do more outreach in this community so that more people know what we're about? You know, you're asking board members to kind of contribute what they thought they'd be doing, as well as understanding the financial budget, as well as coming to meetings. So a board's power lies in the future. One more chunk I want to talk to you about is the legal and fiduciary responsibility. This is some concepts I want to throw out there because I think you need to have heard these. It has to do with the duty of care, the duty of responsibility, and the duty of loyalty, which are the responsibilities of boards. And they're pretty much constant everywhere. So I'm just going to give you some like sticking your toe in the ocean ideas around this. We're just barely touching it. But I just want you to hear these concepts. Like much of today is hear these concepts and start thinking about them. Because your next step is going to be, how do I work with this? How do I make this stuff meaningful to my board? So what we have are 3 duties: duty of care, duty of loyalty, and duty of obedience. So I'm going to show you a slide with each one of these. I thought about not doing it, but I'm going to. And it's the definition, which actually you can Google and get the definition. That's really not the important part to me, but I want to share that with you. Then I have a second slide for each one, and it talks about what is an action? What would that mean for your nonprofit? So that's really what I want you to take away. So duty of care. This is totally a Google definition. It's out there. It's about ensuring prudent use of all resources, including facility, people, and goodwill. Well, I mean, you would expect that. But what does that mean? It means as a board member, they attend the meetings because this is when you get your work done. Don't recruit people to be on your board if they can't come to the meetings, or switch your meeting time or mode. Maybe you can start meeting by Zoom because you can get more people. But it's not good to have boards where people don't come to the meeting. And if that's what you're getting, you need to rethink who you're recruiting and how you're recruiting. And even if it says, if you miss 3 meetings in the bylaws, we're going to get rid of you, nobody knows how to do that. You don't want to get to that point. You want to get people who can be at your meetings, except for maybe, crises. You want your board members to be, a duty of care for a board member means you're prepared advanced. You prepare in advance. But that also means you as an organization need to get me the material ahead of time. Like maybe ask your board members, if we get it to you a week ahead of time, will you be able to read it? And then make sure you've written it in a way that I don't have to read 500 pages just to get to the 5 bullet points that I really need. So it's kind of a balance there. Duty of care means I operate and I show independent judgment. I listen and I make decisions, and I don't just look at the treasurer and how they're voting, or look at the lawyer, how they're voting, or look at the teacher and how they're voting. So independent judgment. And then we as a board review our policies on a regular basis, which might mean different policies every year, but each policy has been reviewed every 4 or 5 years. And yes, you're going to get a copy of the slides, so I'm going to move on because you're not going to get all this first time. So duty of loyalty, you're making decisions that profit the nonprofit, not just me as a member. So I have to put the nonprofit's interest first. And that clearly moves into what we talk about, conflict of interest. Every year you should have board members sign a conflict of interest. There's a procedure for that you could talk to a lawyer. That's not that hard to do, but it could change. Maybe this year my significant other owns a car dealership and next year they don't. So my conflict of interest. A conflict of interest to think about is that people might be on 2 or 3 boards and they're all applying for the same grant from the same institution. So how do you work with that? The second one here, avoidance of opportunities for personal gain or benefit. Now, where I will squeak that is to say, I think it's totally okay to have board members who are enhancing their skill set by being on your board, or improving their reputation or meeting people, but they have to be giving at the same time. So it's not that I have to be on your board and get nothing from it, but I can't prosper. I can't be making decisions that I know are going to bring me money. And you should define confidentiality. That whole Las Vegas rule. What happens in this boardroom stays in this boardroom. This is important. We're dealing with the lives of people. We're dealing with money that's out there. If you don't like the decisions we make here, you should go talk to the president if you think it's not fair. But we're asking for you to understand confidentiality. We're a business entity. This isn't just a potluck of friends. This is a business entity making decisions. So the last one is interesting. It requires you to basically follow your mission. And what that means is you comply with regulatory requirements that matter to you. As I said, it could be how far apart beds are, what you have, what kind of food you serve, how you cook, whatever it is you're doing, how many adults per children, whatever, you comply with requirements, but also that you follow your bylaws, which means, yes, you should go read your bylaws occasionally if you're on the board. And they should be written more in English than legalese. I mean, when I started looking at bylaws, I realized that some are written really, and they're easy to read. So let me see. I think I have another slide here for you to look at a bunch of that I've just shown. Oops, I was on the wrong page. There you go. So this is what we've talked about. Governance versus management, where we looked at the big picture of governance versus the more operational picture. The big picture of governance and the smaller picture, the more in the moment of management. B is the idea of boards need to be nosy, curious, but hands-off. C is the idea of some examples of how boards get their work done through meetings, through committees, through individual work. And D is the idea of the duty of care, loyalty, and obedience. So like before, I'm going to ask you to put something in the chat box. Which one of these jumps out at you as being something you want to learn more about? A, B, C, or D? You know, the hands-on one, it's interesting. I've seen a lot of C, and to me, that's just the hands-on, real practical pieces. How do we get the board and work done? I see a lot of D, and that doesn't have to be kind of in the legal world. It's just making sure people understand. At the beginning, I was seeing some A's. There comes another A. I see you, Kevin. You put an A in there. So the idea of management versus governance and understanding that. So my last slide I want to share with you here. Thank you for putting letters in there. But I do see mostly C's and D's, a few B's and a few A's. That's useful for me to see. I just want to share with you, this is what we talked about today. Trends. So we talked about trends in board development. We talked about the modes of governance. We talked about the 3 roles and 10 responsibilities of board members. Defined management versus governance. Talked about the idea of board, advisory board, working board, just the word board, how boards get work done, and then looking at the legal and fiduciary responsibilities of the duties. So you have a really good start of the bones of some ideas. Any one of these, I think, could be a conversation you have with your board. And we hope, as I said, maybe have some follow-up sessions that are a little bit longer. We can go into this in more depth. So I'm reading some comments here, and we'll get to them because there's a lengthy comment, Tracy. I can't read the whole thing right now, but thank you. That's the end. We're close to, we have 2 minutes left. Whew, I always hate to come in overtime, so I'm under time today by 2 minutes. So I don't know if Jason or Caroline, you want to say something at the end here?
Miss Allen, we wanted to thank you very much for your presentation and sharing all these nuggets with us. Greatly appreciate it. You mentioned something that I wanted to expand upon just a little bit with everybody that's on this call. We are going to be coordinating a couple of training sessions for everybody to be able to have a much more in-depth look from Miss Allen in how board work works and how you expand upon working with your board. So that's going to be coming. It's to be determined. We've got to figure out a little more information on how we're going to design it and structure it for everybody. But it won't take too long for us to have that figured out. So we will email everybody and let them know once we have those dates locked down and we're ready to go with that. And there will be a couple of them so that we make sure that if we miss you at one, you can't attend one, maybe you can make it to the other one as well. I don't see a whole lot of questions that were in the chat, so I don't think we have a lot to answer. And if we do, what we'll do is we'll include anything in the Q&As that we'll be posting to our website. Just wanted to remind everybody that to look for those Q&As. Again, it will take us probably about a week to get all of the research to the answers done, have everything posted to our website so that you can go out there and pull it. But we will be posting all the recordings that we were able to take of the different sessions. We will also be posting the PowerPoint presentations that were used for each one of the different sessions. You'll be able to download all of that from our GCC website, where Kevin showed you to go to this morning. Finally, what I did want to do is to give Caroline Farmer, our executive director, a chance to have any final comments and to close out our workshop today.
Thank y'all. I'm just very pleased that we were able to have Ms. Allen here and to have the GCC staff present on how to better administer your grants. I recommend that even those who are not nonprofits, there is a lot of what Ms. Allen's talking about that is helpful just in our day-to-day running of our offices. And so I would encourage you to look at those nuggets that she can provide otherwise. And for everybody else, go forth, be merry, enjoy, do good things for the state, and thank you for all that you do. Have a good day.
Bye-bye.
And GCC staff, thank you. While we're waiting for everybody to go, I just want to say thank you. Y'all did a great job, and I'm very proud to work with y'all.
Bye.
Bye.